Knowing that the first one was so successful and having an opportunity to do it again, it struck me that both Dune Messiah and then the successive book, Children of Dune, came together as almost one complete story, which by itself completed a chapter in the Atreides saga. And I said, I think I can take both these books and instead of doing them separately, put them together and make another 6-hour miniseries. And I am a fan of the books, so it's difficult for me to decide what to leave in and what we can't keep in. In writing the script, I constantly referred to the book for as much information as Herbert would give me to describe what a thopter looks like, what a worm looks like, what the desert looks like, what the environment, what the palace keep looks like. It did me no service, nor did it help the project to describe down to the last nut and bolt what a worm capture would look like. It was more fun, frankly, to sit with Ernie Farino and all of the geniuses that worked with him and come up with these things.
I hadn't really worked in visual effects prior to this. I had come from an action background, so I had no problem visualizing the bigger action scenes. I had 8 weeks to create the whole environment that went with Children of Dune. Prep was an ongoing thing because we couldn't build every set all at once. Everything had to, we had to go be on one set and go approve how the next set was being built and how we were going to light that so we could get a jump on things. So we're always leapfrogging constantly. It was always a juggling act of how we want to approach the scene, what resources we have to approach it, how much time we actually have to do it. So we always had to be balancing those elements so that we could make the best sequence but still finish it and make sure it was the quality that we expected.
We started, I think, with a budget of 400 visual effects. I think it was 628 was the total number of CG visual effects. If you have a really short pre-production time, you're always essentially chasing your tail, trying to just get the scene shot. Then you figure out how this is going to integrate with CGI and other visual effects. You run into problems that visual effects have to solve. You run into new ideas that, well, wouldn't it be great if we did this? And yeah, it'd be great. Where's your credit card?
A script comes generally to us first, and we'll do a first breakdown, and we will try to isolate every shot we think could be a visual effect in the movie. Some are obvious, spaceship flies across the galaxy. Some might be, they can only afford to build half or a third of the set. We have to supply everything on the right side of the screen or everything out the window. And probably the most outrageous set was Caladan, the interior of Caladan, which doesn't exist at all. That was entirely blue screen.
Blue screen is a process that allows us to isolate either people or objects and then extract them and composite them into a live action scene. And say, for example, like Jessica and Gurney walking in Caladan. Normally you would have a storyboard, and normally the first thing you would shoot is the background plate. In this case, it would have been a set that they've decided we're going to put people into here and make this Caladan. They didn't have a set and they didn't have a design for a set. So they shot the actors first, which is kind of the cart before the horse. You will see that there's just enough blue to cover what's behind the actors and what they're standing on. The rest of it's the soundstage. You can see the grip standing over there reading a Playboy. You can see all the things that are on the set that we are eventually going to get rid of. It was more difficult than a normal average blue screen. In this particular case, they were physically walking on the screen. Not only did they shoot the actors against blue, they also did camera moves, which a few years ago was an inconceivable thing to do. Then we compounded the difficulty by deciding that the floor that they were walking on was shiny marble. That meant we had to put in reflections, which didn't exist because they were walking on a flat blue screen. It was actually easier to take their actual blue screen keyed out image, turn it upside down, throw it out of focus and blur it, and then attach it to them and create the illusion of a reflection.
I mean, the show was an incredible challenge because we were designing it as it was being shot. The largest sequence to work on was the worm capture, and we knew that presented the most problems for what could be shot on the set in Prague, because we knew they'd be very limited as to what they could get. So it, right off the bat, became that was going to be a sequence that Area 51 would have to provide for the show, almost in entirety.
The worm capture sequence actually ran the entire length of the production. It was one of the first things I started and one of the last things I finished. Strangely enough, I think this whole sequence in Dune Messiah is taken up off screen by one sentence. What originally happened is we all got together and figured out how you would capture a giant sandworm, especially if no one had done it before. So we came up with the idea of this folding cage that was underneath the sand, and I laid out maybe about 35 shots in what's known as an animatic, without actors, with CG puppets, if you will, standing in for where the actors would be, to give the editor and the director a sense of the timing of the sequence.
We began animating that, I think it was before the director even came on board. Give them to the editor, Harry, and he cut them together, threw in sound effects, actually scored the whole piece. So it went through a couple variations, but by the time the director was ready to shoot that sequence, it had been fairly fine-tuned.
At that point, they're shooting the actual live action plates of the actors in Prague, so the Czech actors would be watching our footage on the screen while they were acting.
We even suggested camera angles and lighting and everything else from our animatic.
Usually it's done the other way around, but the production was much later than we had time for.
And for the most part, that stayed fairly close.
We actually had some sequences where cables were snapping and cranes were falling. Originally in that shot, they were thrown out into space, and then in the next shot, you see some people hooking up some hooks, and the bodies were falling like rag dolls, but a change came down from the directors to actually have them eat. The worms weren't seen a whole lot in the first miniseries. In this miniseries, they're people riding them all over the place. They're looked at very closely, and as everyone knows, this show was done in high definition. So I had to go in and rebuild the worms, a scale at a time, build them out into maybe a segment, and then build those segments out to make the worm.
At high definition, which was a surprise on this show as well, in the middle of production, you end up with some extraordinarily long render times per frame. The last 10 weeks, 12 weeks of this show, we had 80 processors running constantly. Never stopped. We were rendering, until the very final day before delivery. I mean, you have to kind of run and gun. It's guerrilla filmmaking.
When Tim told me that I was going to be doing the Tiger, I was a little bit nervous because I didn't know where to get reference for. Of course, we do at the zoo right down the street, but I thought about that, and you're not going to get too much reference from tigers that are stuck in a cage. You might get them rolling around on the ground, but that's pretty much it. So I basically went out and tried to get like National Geographic type DVDs until I got like an idea of how big cats move, how they walk, run. It's kind of hard to get into character when you're doing animals, because when you're animating people, you can get up in front of a mirror and you can look at yourself and say, okay, this person's depressed. How would he act? How would he go about doing this? But when you're a tiger, it's kind of hard to get down on all fours and run around the room. I had no storyboards whatsoever. All I had was a sheet of paper that said tigers attack twins. And I would go to Ernie or Tim, and they would say, yeah, just have the tigers run from this side and attack them over here, and put your own touches in it. Getting the tiger movement down so that they could send it to editorial. So they cut it in so they knew how long it was, and also for the sound people, because they wanted to know where to put the tiger roars and where to have them pouncing on something. So Ernie wanted me to just get the animation out of the way and get all that finalized and approved. And then I began working on the muscle and the fat jiggle and on the fur and the lighting. And then finally, last couple months was spent compositing everything in. It basically took me from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, about 6 months for me to complete all of the tiger sequences.
In addition to the more obvious visual effects, flying thopters, giant worms, etc., we also did set extensions.
The sequence in which Jessica walks out of the shuttle is something that prior to Attack of the Clones and Phantom Menace really hasn't been done for television, where entire sequences are created solely in blue screen. Andrew built in the computer an extremely detailed shuttle. And all we had to do was plop it in front of the camera, load in the background plate, move it around until our door lined up with their door. So once we had the shuttle where we wanted it, I took the entire world of Arakeen, the city, and I brought it over and placed it under the shuttle.
Arakeen as a city we rebuilt from scratch. In the first movie, it was seen mostly in two matte paintings, and a fellow named Andrew Harlow spent the better part of the schedule rebuilding that city. I mean, the plumbing worked. The giant plaza in Arakeen is all inlaid with the planets and this whole kind of zodiac feel to it.
Several of the scenes are 100% computer generated. Nothing real about them. So Tim put me on the Stoneburner sequence.
Barry duplicated the live action set down to the rocks, the pots and pans, the baskets. He built an entire 3D set for about 3 blocks. The scene where you see it coming directly at camera and then the camera sort of surfing along, those shots we call Barry Boulevard.
All they had was a couple of storyboards, and we ultimately came up with a column of fire coming up from out of the ground, and then they wanted to have it kind of like come down and flush over the city. And I built some props just having it interact with the fire.
Because it was physically in the computer, when the dust particles flowed down the street, they actually were hitting walls, hitting pots and pans, making them blow, shifting things around.
2 shots, I think, had live action elements. The beginning and the end, where they actually had Paul in the shots. Then I think everything in the sequence is all computer generated.
But there were 399 more shots waiting to go.
When you're in visual effects, you pretty much inherit everything that nobody else wants to do on the show. There are hopefully a number of shots that you'll never know were visual effects. Out the window in Alia's bedroom or office. Every time you see out that window, that's a visual effect. There's the temple behind her. Every time you go to the desert in Children of Dune, there was a very small, a cat box worth of sand that they built, one small dune, and everything beyond that point is computer generated.
So we had hundreds and hundreds of landscapes, dunes and mountains and sky and sun.
The opening main part of the movie is about 2.5 minutes long, entirely CGI.
Then they can move another object around in the scene in the computer, and the worm will follow that object.
The interior highliner is basically 2 tiny walls and a floor space, and everything else is computer generated.
Every little piece of tiger I can animate.
So we inherited Edric. We built him full CG. Susan Sarandon was talking to absolutely no one.
All the morph targets for the facial expressions.
Pixie dust, like Tinkerbell dust flying around.
He can raise his eyebrows up and down, he can close his eyes, he can open his mouth.
Worms,
Snarl, like one cheek up and down.
thopters,
Moving his ears left and right.
Make it spin,
The teeth waggle.
His pupil can dilate.
and it looked real.
Filmmaking is always, you're reinventing the wheel every time you make a movie. You're always learning all the same mistakes over again.